This is Professor Upfer, and this will be the final lecture in our introductory psychology class, and we'll be talking today about happiness and self-esteem. If you look at our textbook, there's almost no mention of happiness or self-esteem at all. And this is a puzzling omission. At the same time, I have to say it is an accurate reflection of the state of the field. If you look at all of the studies conducted between 1887 and 2004, there were 86,767 studies on depression, 70,845 on anxiety, 10,735 on anger, and just 3,938 on happiness. As a field, psychologists are very interested in the negative aspects of the human experience, but the positive aspects of human psychology, or what is sometimes called positive psychology, has not got a lot of research interest. And historically, this is bizarre. As William James said, how to gain, how to keep, how to recover happiness is in fact, for most men at all times, the secret motive for all they do. And you would think that for a field that wants to understand the motives of human beings, then that happiness would be a major source of study. So in this lecture, what I want to do is I want to cover some of the studies that have been done on happiness and the close concept of self-esteem, so that we have a better sense of what studies tell us about how to gain, how to keep, and how to recover happiness. So let's begin with self-esteem. Normally I say, what is self-esteem? And I give you a definition. Let's start out with something that looks like self-esteem, but is not self-esteem. So let me talk about what is not self-esteem. What I have in mind is narcissism. Narcissism is a disorder, was originally in Freudian theory, a sexual disorder. Today, it's used to mean an unhealthy, unrealistic self-regard. It's named after the mortal Narcissus, who was a very handsome lad, as you see here, who was in love with the nymph Echo. And unfortunately, Echo's love was unrequited, and she prayed that Cupid, or Eros in the Greek, would cause him to fall in love with her. So Cupid shot him with an arrow so that he would fall in love with the first thing that he saw. And it just so happened that he was gazing at himself in the pond, and it was himself that was the first thing he saw. And that's where we get the term narcissism. There's widespread evidence of at least a little low-grade narcissism in society. We see this in what's known as the Lake Wobegon effect. The Lake Wobegon effect is named after the fictional town of Lake Wobegon, where all of the women are strong, all of the men are handsome, and where all of the children are above average. And it's a joke, because of course, not all of the children can be above average. That's statistically impossible. Yet, when you ask students if they think that they're below average, average, or above average, over 90% of students think that they're above average. And that's not to pick on students. Over 90% of teachers think they're above average teachers, too. So there must be some narcissism, at least in a low grade, in our society. We also see it in in a now famous effect, the Dunning-Kruger effect. It was a study of confident incompetence. That's how it's often remembered. In this study, they asked people to how good they thought they were at telling jokes. And then they were asked to tell a joke. And then professional comedians rated the jokes that they told. And then people were asked what they thought they would get as a test score for their jokes. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the people who told the worst jokes, the people who told the worst jokes, that's the group that's in the bottom quartile, they thought that their ability to tell jokes and how well other people thought their jokes were was about as high as the people who objectively told better jokes than they did. And their self-perceptions were higher than those who told jokes even better than they did. And the people who were the really best joke tellers actually had a perception of their own joke-telling ability that was hardly different from that of anyone else. So again, we see that people who don't tell jokes really well, just like people who maybe not are the best students, think that they're above average. That again is a kind of low-grade narcissism. Now, when we look at the more clinical or formal definition of narcissism, we see certain features. One is that they tend to say that they like having authority over others, or sometimes the way they think about it is that they have a natural talent for influencing people. They like to be the center of attention. They also like to look at their own bodies. They think that they're an extraordinary person. They agree with statements like, I know I'm good because everyone keeps telling me so. So they're self-absorbed. They also tend to think that they're superior. So I'm a born leader. I can read people like a book. Everybody likes to hear my stories. Everybody likes to hear my jokes. And a sense of entitlement. Like, I insist on getting the respect that is due me. I have a strong will to power. I'm envious of others' good fortunes. Now, this is interesting. It's different from self-esteem. It's different from self-esteem. A person with self-esteem thinks, I'm good. A person with narcissism thinks, I'm better. It's not the same. Now, is there anything wrong with a little narcissism? Is there anything wrong with a little narcissism? Maybe not. There's a famous psychologist by the name of Carl Rogers, who was very popular in the 1970s. He said that a solid sense of personal self-worth is fostered by unconditional positive regard. That's a sense of being accepted and loved without any condition or reservation. That people should just love you because. And an unjustified self-regard might be a little helpful. One way this might be the case is through the Pygmalion effect. So remember, we saw this with respect to stereotype threat, where a person acts in a way to be consistent with the stereotype because that's what's expected of them. So maybe if you expect the best of yourself, you'll act in a better way. Well, there's some evidence that that's true. In one study, they looked at how much litter people discarded into a wastebasket. So people walking by, there'd be litter on the ground. What percentage of people picked it up and threw it in a wastebasket? Or they looked at people's test scores. And then they did an intervention. And the intervention went like this. Either there was no intervention, that was a control group, that's shown in the green line, Or there was a persuasion condition. In the persuasion condition, you'd say to people, should really be picking up litter because it's good for the environment. Or, we really should be studying a little bit harder on our math tests and being more careful because math is really important. Or you might be in the attribution condition. In the attribution condition, what people were told is, we just gave you this test and we can tell that you're the type of person who would pick up litter. Or we can tell that you're the type of person who's really good at math. And then they looked at how people did after this intervention. And what they found is that immediately after being told that they were the type of person who picks up litter, people were much more likely to pick up litter than beforehand. And they were more likely to do so if somebody was trying to convince them that they ought to pick up litter. So there is some evidence for this Pygmalion effect working. A little bit of unjustified self-regard might not be harmful if it causes you to act in ways that improve yourself. On the other hand, unjustified self-regard can also be harmful because the Pygmalion effect can work in the opposite direction. So, for example, people who are aggressive become more so when they encounter people who treat them as if they expect them to be submissive. Also, we know that people with an unjustified high self-regard often simply avoid any negative feedback. We can see this also in the effects of praise on children. Muller and Dweck gave some kids some math problems. And when the kids would get a problem right, half of the kids would be praised for being smart. And the other group, whenever they got a problem right, they were praised for working hard. What Muller and Dweck found is that the students who were praised for their smarts, that's something that's an internal thing that maybe they don't think that they have any direct control over. The ones who were praised for their smarts worried more about their failures. They chose easier problems when given an opportunity. They displayed less enthusiasm, and they gave up more quickly. It's as if that sort of positive self-regard they were trying to protect. And that's why they were choosing easier problems and giving up quickly. Busher and Baumeister also investigated what happens when narcissists versus people with ordinary high self-esteem receive positive and negative feedback about their personality. Now, in response to positive feedback, both people with high self-esteem as well as narcissists behave in a way in which they're pleased. But in response to negative feedback, people with high self-esteem essentially laugh off the negative feedback. It doesn't bother them. But narcissists were more likely to become verbally aggressive, threatening, insulting, and even began to get violent. We can understand these responses as a way of dealing with the self-doubt that they may actually have. This way of reacting in a way to protect yourself from negative feedback is what's known as a defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms are automatic thoughts that shield us from any kind of information that would be a threat to our sense of our own efficacy or worth. They're automatic, avoidant reactions to an anxiety signal. One example of a defense mechanism is called reaction formation. That's the process of turning a frightening wish into its opposite. For example, a boy who pulls the pigtails of the girl he secretly has a crush on. Another is projection. This is the process of ascribing one's own unacceptable emotions to others. So maybe you get in a fight with somebody and they say, well, why are you getting so angry about this? And they shout at you, you're the one who's angry. That's projection. Or intellectualization. This is the process of examining an unacceptable emotion without relating it to the self. So you might be in a fight and somebody says, well, why are you getting so angry? And instead of shouting back, you're the one who's angry, you say, this strikes me as a good example of Aristotle's point about anger. Namely, it's easy to be angry, but being angry with the right person, at the right time, in the right way, that is not within everybody's power, and that is not easy. At that point, you're not even thinking about why you're angry. You're just thinking about anger. That's a defense mechanism. Another example is rationalization. This is the use of conscious reasoning to explain away anxiety-provoking thoughts or feelings. So maybe you have a wife whose husband has just been caught cheating on her, and she can't let herself realize that this is something that is going to cause her anxiety because she doesn't want to break up with him. She's afraid of what's going to happen if she's out on her alone again. And so she rationalizes and she says, well, I'm not really angry at you. I'm more angry at the situation. That's a rationalization, and it's a defense mechanism. So then what exactly is self-esteem? How is self-esteem different from narcissism? Well, when we identify people with high self-esteem, people with high self-esteem have the general conviction that they are competent to live. This is what's called self-confidence or self-efficacy, and that one is worthy of living. This is what's known as self-respect or self-liking. So to measure self-confidence, people are given questionnaires, and they will strongly agree with statements like, I'm highly effective at the things I do. I'm very talented. And they strongly disagree with statements like, I sometimes deal poorly with challenges. I sometimes fail to fulfill my goals. And for self-respect, people strongly agree with statements like, I'm very comfortable with myself, I feel great about who I am, and they strongly disagree with statements like, it is sometimes unpleasant for me to think about myself, I do not have enough respect for myself. Now, self-esteem is a judgment about the self in its totality, what we call global self-esteem, not just specific abilities or qualities. So people with low self-esteem are just as happy when they succeed as people with high self-esteem. But people with high self-esteem feel more pride when they succeed than people with low self-esteem. That means that people with high self-esteem think that they are the cause of their success, whereas people with low self-esteem, although they might be pleased when they succeed, they don't feel themselves to be the cause of their success. Think about, say, the lottery. Anybody would be happy to win the lottery, but you'd be crazy to be proud to win the lottery. It didn't have anything to do with you. People with low self-esteem feel that everything is like the lottery. Now, why is self-esteem so important? Well, some self-confidence and self-respect is critical for survival. If you believe you're totally incapable of living, why try? If you believe you're totally unworthy of life, why go on? And in fact, a decline in self-confidence and self-respect, as well as an attempt to escape the self by means of obliterating your awareness of yourself, avoiding looking at a mirror, avoiding people who mirror you back, and avoidance of yourself in every way by, say, obliterating your mind through chronic drunkenness. All of these are paths on the way to suicide. Suicide is the ultimate escape from self. In addition to this, investigators have examined the effect of self-efficacy and self-respect on memory, persistence, and romance. And in each of these cases, self-efficacy and self-respect play an important role. So, as an example, what do we remember from the feedback that we get? All right. Taffaroti interviewed students, and he provided them with mixed evaluations of their personality, and then later he asked them to recall what they had heard in their evaluations. He found that people who were at high self-confidence but low self-respect remembered more negative feedback than low self-confident, low self-respect people, suggesting that high self-confidence, is associated with a better memory for negative feedback. In contrast, low self-confidence, high respect people remember more positive feedback than high confidence, high self-respect individuals. It seems that positive feedback is something that low self-confident people low in self-confidence, need to maintain their high self-respect. Whereas people who are high in self-confidence but otherwise don't have high self-confidence, forget that kind of thing. Split self-esteem also affects persistence. For example, researchers typically find that people with low self-esteem give up easily after failure. But is it because they have low self-respect or low self-confidence? To test this, Taffaroti gave subjects an impossible anagram task. So you might be given a series of letters, and you have to rearrange them to make a new word. And on this task, they were given a series of anagrams that they couldn't possibly solve. Now, after failing the task, what he found is that subjects with low self-respect were more likely to give up than those with low self-confidence. And those who had low self-confidence were already convinced that they couldn't succeed and went through the motions to confirm their notions. Whereas those who didn't like themselves but had relatively high self-confidence may have withdrawn to preserve their confidence. It also affects romance. So Brennan found that people higher in self-respect report more securely attached relationships, whereas people higher in self-confidence are more likely to dismiss feedback from romantic partners. This differs somewhat for women and men. So in women with securely attached relationships, you often see high self-respect, but not necessarily high confidence, whereas men in securely attached relationships often are high in both. Now, there is another way that people measure self-esteem. Self-esteem is an attitude about the self, and we've already seen that you can have explicit as well as implicit attitudes. And so people have looked at implicit self-esteem. So implicit measures of self-esteem might be an implicit association test, like the one that we saw in stereotypes. Another is a strong preference for one's own initials. So, for example, my initials are J and O. And so if I have high implicit self-esteem, I'm supposed to like words that start with J or O. Maybe that's why I'm at Ohio State. It has an O. Or a preference for birth dates. So my birthday is in March, which is 3. So according to this, if I'm high in implicit self-esteem, I should really like the number 3. I actually do like the number 3. But what we find is, while these correlate sometimes, but not very well with each other, we also find that they correlate sometimes, but not very well with explicit measures of self-esteem. But they don't correlate at all with subjective well-being. But explicit self-esteem highly correlates with subjective well-being. It seems that you have to be able to say explicitly, I'm comfortable with who I am, to be high in subjective well-being. Which brings me to the last topic, subjective well-being. Subjective well-being is what you and I might call happiness. Happiness is something that James says we're all after. And you can kind of see why we might be after happiness. A lot of things go along with happiness. So people who score high in subjective well-being, they say that things are going well in my life, also perceive the world as safer. They make decisions more easily. they rate job applicants more favorably. They're more cooperative. They're more playful and creative. They lead healthier, more energized, and more satisfying lives. If you weren't happy, I would suggest, if you have the opportunity, to be happy. It makes for a lot of good things. But what causes happiness? Well, there's all kinds of hypotheses about what causes happiness. This is a very complicated topic, but many people are under the theory that happiness is caused by certain goods, like a certain personality, having money, having health, having sex, having marriage, having kids, having a certain age, having religion. These are what we might call goods theories of happiness. So if you can get the goods, then happiness will happen as a side effect. So let's examine some of these objective goods and see if they do cause happiness. So first off, is there a happy personality? Well, if we look at the correlation of happiness with various personality traits, as well as how satisfied people are for the big five, what we tend to see is that people who are extroverted, conscientious, and agreeable have moderately high correlations with happiness. People who with low emotional stability or neuroticism tend to have negative correlations with happiness. If we look at how satisfied people are with their lives, being open, conscientious, extroverted, and agreeable show moderate correlations with how satisfied people are with their lives. Being neurotic, not so much. And the same thing with how much people have positive feelings from moment to moment. The same basic pattern, right? So there does seem to be a kind of happy personality. So you want to be high in openness, high in conscientiousness, high in extroversion, high in agreeableness, but low in neuroticism. Moaning Myrtle, my icon of neuroticism, was unhappy. What about money? Does money cause happiness? This is a very interesting question, and it's a little complicated. If you look at surveys of college freshmen at UCLA between 1966 and 2002, what you see is that over time, the percentage of individuals rating being very well off financially has increased very markedly from the 1960s through the 1980s, whereas the percentage of people saying that it was really important to develop a meaningful life philosophy has declined quite a bit. Are these students onto something? Will financial success, being well off financially, cause them happiness? That's an empirical question. Well, one way of looking at this is looking at how satisfied people are with their lives as a function of how important they think money and love is. Often what you find is that people who rate money as more important than love are less satisfied with life than people who rate love as being more important than money. That requires a little caveat, though. Right? Subsequent studies have shown that this difference comes entirely from people who want money because they want it to either prove themselves or gain power or show off. So if you want money to sort of show everybody what a big shot you are, well, maybe you'll buy a big house in a nice neighborhood, and what you'll find is a lot of other people who are big shots, and now you don't seem so special, and so now you're not very happy. All right? So if you want money to show off, it's not going to lead to much life satisfaction. That's a dangerous goal to have. If you like money for other reasons, meh. The other thing that we find is that there's no correlation between changes in national income and happiness. So if you look at the average per person after-tax income in constant dollars, despite what you may have heard, the people are getting richer over time. The median individual, not just the average person, but the median individual too, has gotten richer over time. But the percentage of people rating themselves as very happy hasn't budged. That doesn't look good for the money causes happiness hypothesis. People have thought, well, maybe what causes happiness is being richer than the next person. But we know that some people are a lot richer than others over time. So income inequality has been rising. So you would think that those people in the top quintile, all right, since they're getting even richer than ever before, they would now be even more likely to say that they're very happy. But people's happiness hasn't declined. So even though income inequality is rising, people's happiness is exactly the same. So being richer than the next person or being poorer than the next person isn't having much effect on overall happiness either. On the other hand, we find some links between money and happiness too. So inconsistent with the national level data, within most affluent country, people with lots of money are somewhat happier than those with just enough to afford life's necessities. Also, people in rich countries are also somewhat happier than those in poor countries. Also, those who have experienced a recent windfall from a lottery, an inheritance, or a surging economy often feel some temporary elation. And people that engage in jobs that engage their skills tend to be both well paid and happy. So it does seem like money isn't unrelated to happiness. Well, there's also what we might call this money-happiness paradox. So richer people tend to be happier, but changes in national wealth don't make people happier. Surges in income, like winning the lottery, lead to surges in happiness, but the effects of the windfall on happiness are only temporary. And striving to be rich has no effect on happiness, but if you want to be rich to compensate for low self-esteem, to gain power, to show off to others, wanting to be rich is associated with less happiness. How can we resolve this paradox? Well, there are two complementary explanations for the paradox. The first is what's known as the adaptation level principle, which is that happiness is relative to our prior experience. In this view, what you want is for your experiences to be getting better and better and better. Not just that you get suddenly better and then stay flat. This would explain why lottery winners go back to being as happy as they were before winning the lottery. The other principle is the relative deprivation principle, which is that happiness is relative to our personal comparison group. This would explain why changes in national income and overall income inequality would have no effect on national happiness. The personal comparison group in these cases isn't changing. It would also explain why people who want money to be richer than their neighbors find themselves not very happy once they get richer neighbors. Well, we can use these same principles to understand some other objective goods, like health. So the relation between health and happiness is much like the relation between money and happiness. So people who are healthier tend to be happier. People who exercise tend to be happier. But people who become blind or paralyzed, like lottery winners, usually recover near normal levels of day-to-day happiness. Well, what about love and happiness? Is the relation between love and happiness like the relation between money and happiness and health and happiness? Well, we can look at this in terms of sex and marriage and children as a way of examining this issue. So one study looked at money, sex, and happiness, and the conclusions were the more sex, the happier the person. the happiness maximizing number of sexual partners in the previous year is 1, and married people have more sex than those who are single, divorced, widowed, or separated, and income has no clear effect. Money buys neither more sexual partners nor more sex. So it seems like the more sex, the happier the person, but with one person, maybe married. Kind of what the old-fashioned ideal was, right? In fact, if we look at the percentage of people who are very happy, what you find is that married men and married women are both more likely to rate themselves as being very happy than men or women who have never been married. And this is true from the 1970s all the way through into the 1990s. I haven't looked at more recent data, but I suspect the answer is the same. So even though sometimes people complain about their marriages, they really should think about the fact that their odds are improved. What about children? Well, here what we find is that against the old-fashioned idea that a happy family makes for a happy life, what we find is that people who have no children at home are quite a bit happier than people who do have children at home. The difference isn't so great when you're, say, in your 40s. But if you have children living with you when you're 60 or 80, then you're going to be a lot less happy than people who have no kids at home. And the same thing in the early 20s. A researcher who studies this quite a bit is a textbook writer by the name of David Myers. He's summarized the results this way. He says that researchers have found that happy people tend to have high self-esteem, be optimistic, outgoing, and agreeable, to have close friendships or a satisfying marriage, to have work and leisure that engage their skills, have a meaningful religious faith, and to sleep well and exercise. But happiness is not so much related to factors like age, gender, education levels, parenthood, and physical attractiveness. I wanted to look into a few of these a little bit more closely. So what we've seen here already is personality. Yes, that's related to happiness. Money, yes, but there's some provisos. Health, yes, but some provisos. Sex and marriage, yes. Children, generally, not if they live at home. What about age and religion? We haven't looked at the data on that. All right. Well, what we see with both age and religion is a nonlinear relation. All right. So if you look just at the effect of age, or age controlling for a whole bunch of other things that correlate with age, like when you get older, you tend to have more money. What you find is that the well-being scores, the subjective well-being scores, start out pretty high in between 18 and 21. And it begins to decline all the way to about age 50 to 53. And then it starts to climb again. It starts to climb again, such that somebody who is around 69 to 70 is about as happy as an 18-year-old, all right? And then it goes up from there, all right? So there is a relation between age and happiness, but it isn't a linear relation. It's not as though people start happy and then as they age, they get unhappy, or that they start unhappy and with age, they get happy. It sort of goes in this U-shaped way, all right? And we see something like that for religion too, all right? So if you look at people's scores for unhappiness or even their medical symptoms, all right, and you look at people who are slightly religious, moderately religious, or very religious, the people who are slightly religious are less happy than people who are moderately religious. And people who are moderately religious are less happy than the people who are very religious. Same thing with medical symptoms. Now, if you only look at half of this, you'd say, aha, religion is good for your happiness and medical symptoms. But you have to look at the whole distribution for religion just the same way you have to look at the whole distribution for age. So if you look at people who are anti-religious or not at all religious, people who are anti-religious are more happy than people who are slightly religious. People who are not at all religious are more happy than people who are slightly religious. What this suggests is that what is causing happiness, the highest levels of happiness in the very religious and the anti-religious, might be that they both have something that gives meaning to their lives, that they've developed a meaningful life philosophy. So what we see here is that with age and religion, it's the extremes who are happy. Okay, now I wanted to give one final word about psychology. And the final word is this. There is no final word. As you've seen, I hope, from the assignment that you did in improving the textbook, psychology is constantly improving our understanding of the mind and behavior. Throughout the 20 years that I've been teaching psychology, I have to update my slides every year with new studies that are coming in that are refining, qualifying, and expanding the things that I thought to be true previously. Now, what that means is that you took this course and maybe 20 years from now, things are going to look very different when your kids take the course. And so that means that you really need kind of a way of getting a software update, an automatic software update for your psychology. And so here's what I want to suggest. If you have questions down the road about psychology or new research to tell me about, even if it's 20 years from now, contact me. I'd love to hear from you. I still get students from a long time ago who email me to ask me questions about psychology. And I invite you to do the same thing too. It's the only way that I can sort of give you a warranty for your product purchase. And that will be the final word. Have a great summer.